There is a night, more than 4 decades ago, when a 24-year-old man stood completely still in front of a mirror, repeating the same movement over and over for hours, until his feet ached inside his shoes from the friction of a single, impossible slide. Nobody in his house knew exactly what he was rehearsing. Nobody at the record label knew what was about to happen. Not even the producers of the television special that had booked him had any idea what they were about to broadcast to the entire world. What they did know, and this is something almost nobody remembers today, is that this man came within a hair of rejecting the invitation 3 separate times, and that if it were not for a tense, almost hostile negotiation with the very same executive who had broken his family's trust years earlier, that night would never have existed at all. Michael Jackson did not walk onto the stage of Motown 25 as a comfortable star casually celebrating an anniversary special. He walked out carrying an open wound from his adolescence, someone who was about to use 5 minutes of live television to settle a score with his own past, and what almost nobody knows is that in the exact instant millions of people were screaming in pure euphoria, he, behind that perfect smile, felt deeply disappointed in himself. That contradiction, that secret he kept hidden for years, is only the first of several twists buried inside this story, because what you are about to discover is not simply how the Moonwalk was born, but why that night was actually a calculated move of power, of family pride, of quiet revenge, and of an almost obsessive need for creative control that would end up rewriting the rules of live performance forever. And by the end, you'll understand why the very thing that made that night so perfect for the rest of the world was, in Michael's own mind, the one thing he never quite forgave himself for. To understand why Michael came so close to turning his back on the opportunity that would define his entire career, we have to travel back to the mid-1970s, when the Jackson 5, already transformed into childhood idols, began noticing that their record label was treating them like an exhausted formula instead of evolving artists. Berry Gordy, the man who had built the Motown empire from nothing, refused to give them more creative freedom, more royalties, more control over their own sound, dismissing every request Michael and his father brought to his office as unnecessary risk. When the family decided to break the contract and sign with CBS instead, a label willing to hand them exactly what Motown wouldn't, Gordy answered with a retaliation that many still consider, to this day, one of the pettiest decisions in the history of the music industry. He forbade the group from ever using the name the world knew them by, forcing them to rebrand themselves simply as the Jacksons overnight, and he pressured his own son-in-law, Jermaine, who had married into the Gordy family, to abandon his brothers and stay tied to the label rather than follow them into a more promising future. Michael was barely 18 years old when all of this happened, and although he managed to rebuild his career with astonishing speed, that betrayal stayed lodged in his memory in a way that very few biographies bother to explore in enough depth. Because this was not just about money or contracts. Gordy had been, at some point, an almost paternal figure in his life, someone Michael trusted the way a son trusts a mentor, and watching that same man be capable of tearing down the legacy they had built together taught him a brutal lesson about the entertainment business, a lesson that would shape every decision he made from that point forward. Hold on to that detail, because it resurfaces later in a way most people never connect. Let's move ahead now to 1982, when Thriller was beginning to turn into a phenomenon that not even CBS itself was expecting. Michael, by this point, was no longer the child prodigy from Motown. He was a grown man who had spent years secretly studying the movements of dancers like Fred Astaire and Sammy Davis Jr., but above all obsessively devouring the work of a choreographer almost nobody mentions in this context, Bob Fosse, whose theatrical, angular style, full of restrained tension and shadow, would become the invisible foundation of everything Michael was about to show the world. And it was precisely in the middle of that meteoric rise that Motown decided to organize a television special to celebrate its 25th anniversary, a tribute designed to reunite the legends who had built the sound of Detroit. The irony is that, at first, Michael wanted absolutely nothing to do with the project, a fact that would have completely rewritten pop culture history had it stayed true. What happened next is where this story truly starts to get interesting, because the reason Michael refused to participate went far beyond simple resentment toward Gordy. In the early 80s, the singer was going through a kind of quiet media fatigue that almost nobody around him fully understood. He had spent years appearing on variety shows, interviews, and specials alongside his brothers, to the point of feeling that his image was wearing thin in front of the cameras, overexposed to a public that had started to see him as a permanent fixture rather than an evolving artist. That's why he had decided to step away almost completely from live television, limiting his public appearances mostly to his music videos, where he had absolute control over every detail, every angle, every single edit, every frame that would ever reach an audience. And that is exactly the problem Motown 25 represented for him. It was a program recorded in front of a live audience, with no possibility of retakes, with no decision-making power over how the final result would look once it reached households across the country. For a perfectionist like Michael, that wasn't simply uncomfortable, it was practically intolerable, a total surrender of the one thing he valued most in his career. So when Berry Gordy walked personally into the studio where Michael was recording to convince him to take part, arriving unannounced after years without any real contact between them, what happened inside that room was far more than a friendly chat. It was a tense negotiation, one in which Michael, far from feeling grateful for the invitation, set conditions that no other artist on that lineup would have dared to demand. He would agree to sing a medley of Jackson 5 classics with his brothers, yes, a gesture that would please the family and satisfy Motown's nostalgia-driven format, but he also wanted to perform, solo, a song that didn't even belong to Motown's catalog at all, Billie Jean, a track that at the time legally belonged to their direct competitor, CBS Records, and one that was currently dominating the charts while its groundbreaking video played on constant rotation on MTV. Gordy, stunned, flatly refused, arguing it was absurd to promote the competition at his own company's anniversary celebration. And here is where Michael revealed a strategic coldness that few people ever give him credit for. He simply answered that if they wouldn't let him perform that song, there would be no deal at all, and that he was fully prepared to walk away from the special completely, no matter how much it cost him publicly. Gordy, calculating that losing the biggest star of the moment would be a far bigger disaster than any contractual technicality, gave in, ending the conversation with a hug that masked just how much ground he had actually conceded. But what came next was even bolder. Michael, still unwilling to hand over any creative control, demanded that his performance not even be recorded or broadcast at all, and only after an additional, separate negotiation with Motown's then-president, Suzanne de Passé, did they reach an unprecedented agreement, one in which Michael himself was granted the right to personally edit the final version of his own performance before it ever aired, a privilege no other artist that night would ever receive, and one that told everyone involved just how seriously he was treating those 5 minutes. On March 25, 1983, at the Pasadena Civic Auditorium, the special Motown 25, Yesterday, Today, Forever, was finally recorded, in front of an audience packed with legends of African American music, thrilled simply to witness a reunion decades in the making. Stevie Wonder, Diana Ross, Lionel Richie, The Temptations, Marvin Gaye returning to television after years away from the public eye, and dozens of other artists who represented the golden era of the label all filled that room with an energy of nostalgia and reverence. But here it's worth pausing on something most retellings of that night completely ignore. Nobody among the producers, absolutely nobody, expected that program to become a historic moment. The original intent was simple, almost nostalgic, meant to pay tribute to a musical catalog that already belonged to the past, with solemn, traditional performances, with no intention whatsoever of breaking any mold or reinventing anything. This was meant to be a celebration of what Motown used to be, not a launchpad for what entertainment was about to become. Michael and his brothers opened their segment performing I Want You Back, with a Michael visibly different from the boy the public remembered, dressed in a combination he had assembled almost at the last minute, a shirt covered in crystals that reflected light in an almost hypnotic way, paired with the white socks and crystal-covered glove he had already been wearing in public appearances for a while, and a black sequin jacket that, according to accounts, he had borrowed from his own mother's closet just hours before the show. Then came The Love You Save, and finally a version of Never Can Say Goodbye, in which Jermaine, absent from the group for more than 8 years since that forced departure we mentioned earlier, sang alongside his brothers again for the first time since leaving, a moment loaded with an emotional weight the audience felt instantly, a small act of reconciliation playing out in real time in front of a room full of witnesses, even though nobody imagined yet that the truly historic part of the night hadn't even begun. When his 5 brothers left the stage amid hugs and applause, Michael stayed completely alone under the lights, and in that instant he said a line that sounds almost prophetic today. He said he loved the old songs, but that he loved the new ones too. And it was right after that sentence that the world, without knowing it yet, was about to witness the birth of an icon. What very few documentaries explain in enough detail is that the entire choreography for Billie Jean was not a spontaneous improvisation fueled by the adrenaline of the moment, but the result of years of absolutely secret preparation, in which Michael tirelessly studied Bob Fosse's theatricality, Fred Astaire's elegance, and above all, something rarely mentioned, the moves of anonymous street dancers from New York and Los Angeles, performers whose names never made it into any history book, but whose style ended up immortalized through Michael Jackson's body in front of millions of viewers. The way he picked up the felt hat with a sharp, calculated motion, the opening pose in which he partially hid his face beneath its brim, the pelvic movements that broke completely with the childlike image the audience still held of him, all of it was designed, down to the millimeter, to create a sense of mystery, almost theatrical menace, as if a mime had decided to take over a rock stage and rewrite its rules from the inside out. Throughout the song, Michael carried a defiant, almost combative expression, moving as if his body weighed nothing at all, every gesture agile and weightless, blending contained energy with the polished physical vocabulary of the funk era he had grown up idolizing. And then, during the instrumental break, when that iconic guitar riff kicked in, Michael executed a short sequence of steps that functioned as a preamble to something the audience had never seen on mass television before. He slid backward with a fluidity that defied all visual logic, as if he were floating over an invisible surface, in a movement we know today as the Moonwalk, but which at that exact moment had absolutely no name for the audience watching it live, no context, no explanation, nothing to compare it to. What happened in the seconds that followed is, quite possibly, one of the most fascinating and least told episodes in the entire history of modern television, because the audience literally didn't know how to react for several seconds, caught in a mix of astonishment and disbelief, until it finally erupted into an ovation so intense that it forced the show to pause so people could recover their composure. Journalist Stephen Ivory, who was present that night, later recounted that the crowd's emotion was so overwhelming that many attendees ended up in tears, unable to process what they had just seen, and that even as the show tried to move forward, guests could not stop talking about what Michael had just done, whispering about it through the rest of the program's performances. And yet, here comes one of the most revealing twists in this entire story. Michael finished his performance feeling completely dissatisfied with himself. The original choreography called for a final spin in which he was supposed to stop abruptly on his toes and hold that position for several seconds, something he had rehearsed flawlessly for years without a single mistake. But that night, under the pressure of the most important moment of his career up to that point, he barely managed to hold the pose for a split second before losing his balance, a detail so tiny that absolutely nobody in the audience noticed it, a flaw invisible to everyone except the one person standing on that stage. It plunged him into a quiet sadness while everyone around him, including his own brothers, his parents, and even legends like Diana Ross, rushed over to congratulate him. It was, as the story goes, a child who approached him backstage after the show, simply telling him it had been amazing, who finally managed to pull him out of that relentless state of self-criticism, reminding him without even realizing it that the real impact of what he had just done went far beyond any technical imperfection that only he himself could perceive. When the special finally aired in the United States on May 16, 1983, broadcast nationally on NBC, the effect was instant and completely disproportionate to anything anyone had predicted. Thriller's sales jumped by 4 million additional copies in an extremely short span of time, a phenomenon no record executive had even remotely anticipated for an album that had already been out for months. But reducing the legacy of Motown 25 to sales figures would mean ignoring the real scale of what happened that night, because what Michael Jackson achieved in front of those cameras can honestly be compared to only two earlier moments in the history of American television, Elvis Presley's appearance and the Beatles arriving on The Ed Sullivan Show, both of which had reshaped how an entire generation understood celebrity and spectacle. With the crucial difference that Michael achieved it as a black artist in an era when that kind of mainstream, unfiltered television spotlight was extraordinarily rare, turning those 5 minutes into a moment of cultural affirmation that went far beyond music alone, one that placed black artistry at the very center of the American living room in a way television rarely allowed. The program ended up being rebroadcast across Latin America, Europe, and Asia, turning a single 5-minute performance into a genuinely global television event, and artists like Fred Astaire, Gene Kelly, and Bob Fosse himself personally called Michael to congratulate him, recognizing in him something they themselves had spent their entire careers chasing: the ability to turn a simple dance into an unrepeatable cultural event witnessed by millions at the exact same moment. Yet not everything that followed was as triumphant as the applause suggested. The explosion in record sales and the sudden surge in Michael's global visibility gave his father new leverage, and it wasn't long before pressure mounted for Michael to reunite with his brothers for another album and another tour, a decision that reignited old family tensions Michael thought he had already left behind, and one that, indirectly, would place him back in situations he no longer wanted any part of, including the commercial shoot that later led to the infamous accident that left lasting physical and emotional scars. It's a chapter of this story that deserves its own space, but it's worth mentioning here because it shows how success, even success this enormous, rarely arrives without a cost attached. Still, none of that erases what Motown 25 represented for his career and for the culture at large. What very few people analyze closely enough is how that single night ended up fixing, almost by accident, the entire artistic philosophy Michael would pursue for the rest of his life, the obsession with surprising people, with always offering something the audience could never have imagined before, a mindset that would later show up in every music video he directed down to the smallest detail. Every stadium tour built around theatrical entrances, every performance designed not just to promote a song but to be remembered forever as its own standalone cultural moment. Motown 25 wasn't simply another performance in his career. It was, in essence, the secret laboratory where the tireless perfectionist we would all come to recognize as the king of pop was truly born, the artist who understood that a single person on a stage, with nothing more than his body and one unforgettable dance, could manufacture pure illusion out of thin air. Even decades later, after stadium tours with massive screens, impossible special effects, and multimillion-dollar production budgets, nobody has managed to replicate the cultural shockwave those 5 minutes created with nothing but a hat, a glove, and a spotlight. A title that, curiously, nobody was using yet on that night in 1983, but one that, after 5 minutes on that stage, nobody would ever be able to argue against again, a coronation disguised as an anniversary special, and quite possibly the single most important performance of his entire career. It's worth stepping back for a moment to really measure what this meant in context, because television in 1983 didn't work the way it does now. There was no way to rewatch a clip instantly, no way to share it, no algorithm ready to push it in front of millions of people who missed the original broadcast. If you weren't in front of your television set on the night of May 16th, you simply didn't see it, at least not until someone taped it and passed the recording around, which is exactly what happened. Bootleg copies of that 5-minute performance circulated for years afterward, traded almost like folklore, studied frame by dancers, choreographers, and curious teenagers trying to figure out the mechanics of a move that seemed to defy the basic rules of how a human body was supposed to move. That scarcity, ironically, only deepened the myth. In an era before the internet, before viral culture as we understand it today, Michael Jackson still managed to create something that spread by word of mouth with the same intensity a viral video would today, proving that genuine surprise, real innovation delivered at exactly the right moment, will always find its audience regardless of the technology available to spread it. Decades later, when Michael performed at the Super Bowl in 1993, commentators would praise it as a masterclass in how to command a massive stage, and that praise was entirely deserved. But what's almost more remarkable is that 10 years earlier, with a single spotlight, a hat, and roughly 300 square feet of stage space, Michael Jackson had already delivered a performance that still leaves people speechless when they watch it today, more than 40 years later, without a single pyrotechnic, without a single dancer beside him, without anything except his own body and a song. And that, in the end, might be the most important lesson buried inside this entire story. Because in the decades since that night, we've watched performances built on massive budgets, elaborate stage design, pyrotechnics, holograms, and effects that would have seemed like science fiction back in 1983. Yet almost none of them have managed to reach the level of cultural saturation that 5 minutes in Pasadena achieved with essentially nothing but a man, a microphone, and a song that was already a hit before he ever stepped onto that stage. That's the paradox at the heart of Motown 25. It wasn't the biggest production of the night. It wasn't even supposed to be the most memorable segment of the show. And yet it became the only part anyone still talks about, more than 4 decades later, precisely because it wasn't built around spectacle for its own sake, but around a single, perfectly executed idea, delivered by someone who had spent years quietly preparing for a moment nobody else even realized was coming. Michael Jackson, at 24 years old, didn't just cement his own status as a legend that night. He rewrote, almost by accident, the blueprint every performer since has tried to follow, whether they realize it or not, proving that a single, perfectly timed moment of genuine surprise can outlast every stadium show, every award ceremony, and every multimillion-dollar production that came after it, remaining, even today, the standard against which every unforgettable live performance is still quietly measured. And maybe that's why, more than 40 years later, people still stop scrolling the moment those 5 minutes appear on their screen, even if they've already seen it 100 times before, even if they already know exactly what's coming, that hat, that glove, that slide backward that still somehow looks impossible no matter how many times you watch it in slow motion trying to understand the mechanics behind it. There's something almost irreplaceable about watching an artist discover, in real time, in front of a live audience with no safety net and no second take, exactly how far a single idea can travel when it's executed with absolute conviction. Michael Jackson walked out that night carrying old wounds, quiet resentment, a family history far more complicated than the celebratory framing of the special ever allowed, and a level of perfectionism that made him miserable even in his own moment of triumph. And somehow, out of all of that tension, out of all of that unresolved history colliding at exactly the right moment, something close to magic happened anyway, the kind of magic that doesn't need explaining because it explains itself the instant you see it, and that, more than any statistic or any chart position, is the real reason Motown 25 still refuses to be forgotten. Not because it was flawless, not because everything went exactly according to plan, but because for 5 unrepeatable minutes, a 24-year-old man turned every ounce of his doubt, his history, and his hunger into something the whole world would spend the rest of its life trying to describe, and never quite managing to fully explain.